Good evening and welcome. My name is John Grossman, and I'm a member of the Board of Directors for the Forest History Association of Wisconsin. And I'd like to welcome you to the 5th session of our fall webinar series titled Elk in Wisconsin, History. Our speakers for tonight will feature Anna Brose, and she'll be assisted by a guy named Ron Eckstein, who has a long history of a presence in this Northwoods area and in some of the elk habitat we'll be talking about. Anna is a graduate student at the University of Wisconsin-Madison. Prior to starting her master's program in 2019, she worked for the Wisconsin Department of Natural Resources as the assistant deer and elk ecologist in Madison. She has also worked for various state and federal agencies, including the Alaska Department of Fish and Game, Colorado Parks and Wildlife, and Isle Royal, Voyageurs, and Yellowstone National Parks. She completed her bachelor's in wildlife and conservation biology at Colorado State. At UW-Madison, Anna studies elk habitat selection in Wisconsin in partnership with the Wisconsin Department of Natural Resources. Ron Eckstein currently chairs the forestry work group of Wisconsin's Green Fire Conservation Organization. He retired from Wisconsin DNR after 36 years as wildlife biologist at Rhinelander. He's worked on forest habitat issues, including biodiversity, early successional forests, and old growth forests, and specialized in eagle and osprey recovery, as well as wild rice conservation. Ron earned his BS and MS in wildlife ecology at UW-Madison. He continues to volunteer with WDNR on eagle, osprey, and amphibian surveys. He serves on the board of the Northwoods Land Trust, chairs the Wisconsin chapter of the Wildlife Society's Forest Issues Committee, works on forest habitat issues with Partners in Forestry and the Forest Stewards Guild, and is a member of DNR's Silvicultural Guidance Team. I think you'll welcome questions, and both of them will, and I expect you'll have a lot. As I now hand off to our presenters, please consider a couple of issues to aid the success of this webinar. First, note questions you may have for the presenter during the presentation, and then take time to pose them via the chat feature in Zoom at the bottom of your screen. Note there's chat and question and answer. Utilize chat. If you're new to Zoom and have challenges navigating the system, you can pose a question to get help from the facilitator, also using that feature. And finally, after the session is over, please consider completing the short survey offered at the chat feature as well. Following the advice that all of life really is connected across the miles and years, you can help us better connect by offering productive feedback and keeping that connection healthy and up to date. Now, along with you, we look forward to this evening's presentation.
Thank you so much, John. I will share my screen here. There we go. You guys see that okay?
Yep.
All right, let's see. Sorry, I'm having a little trouble on my end here. I think it shared it to your screen and it disappeared it from my screen. That's going to be challenging. There we go. All right. Well, thank you guys so much for having me. Like John said, my name is Anna Brose. I'm a second-year graduate student at the University of Wisconsin-Madison. And prior to that, I worked with the Wisconsin Department of Natural Resources in the elk management program. I would just like to reiterate that my opinions are my own and don't reflect that of the DNR or the university, but I don't think we'll have anything too controversial here tonight. So my research in Wisconsin focuses on elk habitat selection and specifically elk use of wildlife openings that are maintained specifically for elk and deer and other wildlife that require early successional habitat. And my job as a graduate student in partnership with the Wisconsin DNR is to find out what benefits elk get from these openings and whether or not we're managing them to the best of our abilities in terms of cost and benefits. But tonight I want to talk a little bit about the history of elk in Wisconsin, because it's kind of been an up and down battle for elk since the 1800s. And before we really get into it, I'd like to take a moment to acknowledge the land that we're on. I recognize that we're all scattered across the state and potentially the country even, but the land that my employer is on, the University of Wisconsin-Madison, is on land that was forcibly ceded from the Ho-Chunk Nation in 1832. And my research area in the Chequamegon-Nicolet National Forest and the land that Eagle River is on, where we were supposed to be meeting, are both on territory of the Ojibwe people. And again, that was forcibly ceded from them in the 18 and 1900s. Now, all of the history I'm going to talk about with elk today is post-European settlement. It's told from a European and scientific perspective, but I'd just like to acknowledge the deep and centuries-long history of people and elk and habitat that came long before European settlers and long before my research here. And I would also like to acknowledge that the habitat stewardship by Indigenous peoples of this area really allowed elk and other wildlife to thrive here. And to be perfectly honest, I wouldn't need to be here today telling the story of elk reintroductions if it hadn't been for European settlers really wiping elk off the landscape. So I'd just like to take a moment and acknowledge that there's a much deeper history here than what we're going to be able to cover, covering the history of elk in the 1900s and 2000s. Elk are historically native to Wisconsin. We have written and fossil and bone records of elk in 50 of the 72 present day counties. You can see on this map, there's most of those locations where we have written or bone fragment history of elk are in the southern half of the state. That's likely for two reasons. First, because the habitat in southern Wisconsin was much more open. It was primarily, the oak savanna and plains that you think of when you see elk in the Rockies, you think of that open area. But we also have records of elk up into the northern half of Wisconsin as well. And just a little spoiler alert, the two stars you see on the map are locations where we currently have elk in Wisconsin. So that kind of puts it into perspective of where elk used to be in Wisconsin and where they are now. Now, the elk we have in Wisconsin today are not the same subspecies of elk that were historically native to Wisconsin. We had a subspecies of elk here called the eastern elk. It was endemic across Wisconsin and all of the eastern US, but that subspecies was completely wiped out by unregulated hunting and poaching in the early 1800s to 1900s. So when we talk about elk in Wisconsin today, we're talking about a slightly different subspecies than was here historically. Now, we think that the last elk in Wisconsin was probably shot sometime around 1868. That's the best record that we have, but it's generally concluded that elk were completely gone from Wisconsin by the 1870s, which is pretty astounding to think because they were so numerous here at one point. And this followed a trend across North America. It's a story that most of us are probably familiar with. Market hunting came in, they were very proficient at hunting elk and other big game in America that were naive to Western methods of hunting. And in many cases, these elk were harvested, their hides were taken to be sold, and the meat was left to rot. So it's a familiar story, and it had big impacts on the landscape of Wisconsin. Now, luckily for us, there were small pockets of elk that remained in Western North America, primarily Yellowstone National Park area. So that was kind of the seed from which most elk populations that we have today come from. There were several early attempts to reintroduce elk to Wisconsin starting in the early 1900s. So in 1913, Wisconsin acquired a quote unquote carload of elk, as it shows up in the literature. This is talking about a train carload of elk, not like an SUV stuffed full of elk. But that train car of elk was shipped across the continent from Yellowstone National Park in the middle of winter, and most of the elk in that shipment died. So only 2 cow elk survived that trip. They were released into a 300-acre enclosure at the Trout Lake Game Farm, which was run by the Wisconsin Conservation Commission. So they were released into that enclosure along with about 100 deer that lived there. And there was one bull that was donated at some point that also was in that enclosure, but there was only those 3 elk for several years. And then in 1917, 40 more elk were shipped to Wisconsin from Jackson Hole, Wyoming, excuse me. And this time they shipped them during the summer instead of the middle of winter, and they used what was deemed expedited shipping to get those elk to Wisconsin in a timely manner. So that was a much more successful reintroduction, and most of the elk survived and were released into that Trout Lake enclosure. That herd at Trout Lake peaked at about 45 animals and was capped at Trout Lake for about 20 years. But by the early 1930s, the elk and deer in that enclosure had depleted most of the available browse in the enclosure. As I'm sure many of you are familiar with, in areas where we have high number of deer in Wisconsin, they can really chew down on that browse very quickly. So by 1931, the Conservation Commission was continuously providing supplemental feed, especially in the winter, which cost about $500 a year, which was quite expensive if you think about 1931 and what was going on with the Great Depression. So the Conservation Commission started trying to kind of pawn these elk off on various zoos and parks throughout the Great Lakes region to get that herd back down to a carrying capacity that would be sustainable in that enclosure. And that was somewhat successful. They got down to about 15 elk. But in 1932, they decided, you know what, this still isn't worth it. We're just going to let these elk go. So in August of 1932, they cut down part of the fence and let the elk loose into the Wisconsin Northwoods. They did have to continue supplementally feeding those elk for several years. Most of them had been born at the Trout Lake facility and were used to getting hay every day. In this picture, you can actually see 2 hay bales in the bottom right and left corner. So these elk were accustomed to getting fed. They didn't really know how to browse, and it took several years to kind of wean them off of that supplemental feed. That free-ranging herd eventually moved south from Trout Lake and set up a home range just north of Woodruff. The population again reached about 40 animals during the 1940s. But by the 1950s, they were once again extirpated from the state due to poaching and conflicts with farmers and other sorts of desperation shooting. So once again, elk were absent from the Wisconsin landscape. And it stayed that way for several decades. And then in the early 1990s, there was another push to bring elk back to the state. The state legislature asked the Wisconsin Department of Natural Resources to investigate the possibility of bringing elk or moose or caribou back to the state. We did used to have woodland caribou in Wisconsin. They were extirpated many, many years ago. And we do still have moose in the state, but it's a pretty low number and there's not much of a breeding population. So the state legislature was like, hey, what if we brought some of these ungulates back to the state? So the Wisconsin DNR did a feasibility assessment. They determined that elk would be the most likely to lead to a successful reintroduction. Elk are a little bit more hardy against brainworm and a little more adaptable in their habitat requirements than moose and caribou. So they said, if we're going to do it, elk is the one. That effort petered out a bit, and then there was a large community-led grassroots movement of support to bring elk back to the state. And that's really what pushed this plan into action. And originally, the plan was to release elk into the Bayfield County Peninsula area, but there was some pushback from the local folks up there with the agricultural community who had concerns about bringing elk to that area. So after all this deliberation, it was finally deemed that elk could be released into the Chequamegon-Nicolet National Forest in the Great Divide District. And the University of Wisconsin-Stevens Point was given authority to acquire some elk and release them into the Great Divide District as an experimental reintroduction. So in 1995, it finally all comes together. Wisconsin acquired 25 elk from Michigan. The state of Michigan had previously had a successful elk reintroduction, and they supplied these 25 elk as a gift. The elk were released near Clam Lake, Wisconsin after an acclimation and quarantine period. And here in this picture, you can actually see Governor Tommy Thompson holding the gate open as the first elk steps off the trailer from Michigan. And the legs and feet you can see just to the left of Governor Thompson belong to longtime elk proponent Bernie Lemon. If any of you had the pleasure of knowing him, he was a big proponent of the elk reintroduction and part of that grassroots movement that brought elk back here. So at this point, the herd was considered experimental. They were monitored by UWSP until 1999. At that point, the elk herd had grown to about 40 elk, and the reintroduction was considered a success. So at that point, the management authority was transferred to the Wisconsin Department of Natural Resources. This is kind of a cool story. This is a trail cam photo of a cow elk known to researchers as Cow 13. And she was actually captured as a calf in Michigan. She was on that trailer that came to Wisconsin in 1995. And she just died last year in the spring of 2019 of natural causes at the age of 25 years old, which is just mind-boggling to me. It's a pretty astounding age for a large ungulate to reach, especially given the fact that she lived in an area with wolves and bears and other hazards. So she was really quite extraordinary in the fact that she lived so long. She was the last of those original Michigan elk to die, and she has many descendants throughout the butternut area of Wisconsin where she kind of set up her home range. And another fun fact about Cow 13 is that as far as the biologists know in that area, no elk from her cow-calf subgroup ever was killed by wolves while Cow 13 was alive. And they really attribute this to Cow 13's ornery nature, to put it nicely. Apparently she was quite a handful to handle when they placed an elk telemetry collar on her. And you can see in this picture, this was from August 2018. She was aged 24 years and she was starting to lose some body condition. You can see she was a little skinny. And so by the next spring, her fat resources had depleted and she did die, we believe, of natural causes. So really a testament to the resiliency of these animals. So this is the current Clam Lake Elk Range outlined in black. The elk range is 1,500 square miles, give or take. It's about 80% public land. You can see that it's dominated by the Great Divide District of the Chequamegon-Nicolet National Forest in dark green. We also have the Flambeau River State Forest in orange, as well as county forests and forests enrolled in the MFL program. So this is a primarily forested habitat with some agriculture mixed in, and it's primarily public lands that the elk get to roam on. Since their reintroduction, elk have been closely monitored using radio and GPS collars. We've got trail cameras out there, and we also do intensive population observations. So their birth and death rates are tracked pretty closely. We know a lot about their life history and what types of habitats they prefer. It's really a researcher's dream because it's just a treasure trove of data on these elk. DNR staff and volunteers search for elk calves each year. You can see this picture on the right. This is an elk calf being collared. And we also do a lot of work on habitat improvements and public outreach and education. Elk have really turned into an ideal ambassador animal. And so there's a lot of community education surrounding the elk in Wisconsin. Since their reintroduction, their population has grown slowly and steadily, but their population growth rate did start to slow down around 2005. And this is fairly typical of a reintroduced population of ungulates. A lot of times you'll get that fast initial growth rate, and then it kind of slows down as they get settled in. So their population growth rate did start to slow down about 10 years after they were reintroduced. So to that end, in 2012, the Wisconsin Department of Natural Resources decided to bring some more elk in from Kentucky to bolster that population growth and to increase the genetic diversity that we have. So they entered an agreement with the state of Kentucky. Kentucky, like Michigan, also had a successful elk reintroduction. And their elk came from a number of states out west. So they had a good genetic diversity in their population and were willing to help us acquire some elk and bring them back to Wisconsin. And the agreement was for 150 elk total to be transferred. Half of those were destined to go to the northern herd near Clam Lake to bolster that herd. And then the other half were to be sent to Jackson County to establish a second elk population in the state. So between 2015 and 2019, the DNR and the state of Kentucky conducted elk captures in partnership. They used traps and helicopter captures. You can see here that there's an elk being transported by a helicopter in a sling, all blindfolded. I'm sure there's a joke about flying elk in there, but I won't go there. So those elk were safely captured. They went through a quarantine period and then were transferred to Wisconsin. And as was planned, the elk were split between that northern elk range you can see on the top half of that map and the Jackson County area. They were released into Black River State Forest there to establish a second smaller herd. There were a total of 164 elk released over those years. That included the 150 elk from Kentucky, as well as some calves that captured cows gave birth to while they were in the acclimation period. Most of the elk that were captured were adult females in prime breeding age, again, because we were trying to increase that population growth rate. So those prime age cow elk are the ones that produce the most offspring. There were some yearling males mixed in, like this guy in the picture. You can see him with his awkward antlers. And you'll also notice that he's got quite a bit of jewelry on, as we like to call it. So all the elk that were transferred were given ear tags with identification numbers, and most of them were also fitted with these GPS collars, so we could track where they kind of liked to hang out once they were released. So currently, or as of a month or two ago, there are approximately 280 elk in the northern herd near Clam Lake. That was at the annual peak of their population growth when all the calves were being born. And that central herd in Jackson County is sitting at about 80 elk or so. The primary causes of mortality for elk currently include predation and vehicle collisions, but also brainworm, which is a parasitic worm that's carried by white-tailed deer. So we do get some mortalities from disease like that, but so far there's been no documented cases of chronic wasting disease in Wisconsin elk. And other than the brainworm, there really isn't too much disease that we've had to deal with. In 2018, the northern elk population near Clam Lake had reached a high enough level that we were able to hold a limited bulls only hunt. So that hunt has occurred for 3 years in a row now. The tags are split between state hunters and tribal hunters because it is within the ceded territory of northern Wisconsin. Like I mentioned, that hunt is restricted to bulls only, and only Wisconsin residents can apply for those tags. So the reason we were able to do this, even though we're still trying to get those population numbers up, is that elk have a polygamous breeding strategy. So you only need one bull for every couple of cows. And we really had a high bull to cow ratio in that population compared to what you would see in a more established elk population out west. So the DNR felt that it was sustainable to harvest several bulls from that population over the last couple of years and still have a very viable and growing population of elk. Additionally, all the fees that came from people applying to those tags have gone straight back into elk management. So we've been able to fund projects on habitat improvement and other projects to make sure that elk are sustained here for a long time to come. Looking into the future, the DNR has no reason to believe that we won't continue to see that annual population growth continue. The elk have really been embraced by the local community, especially in the town of Clam Lake. If any of you have been through there, you just have to look at the gas station logo, which is an elk inside a heart, to realize how much these communities care about the elk. We do have a number of research projects going on involving elk in Wisconsin, including my own research, and then more research both on the academic side at University of Wisconsin-Madison and on the DNR side. And we're continuing to develop these education and outreach programs and opportunities. Obviously, that's been challenging given COVID, but we're adapting. So the DNR is also working on a new elk management plan, which should be completed sometime this year or early next year. And that will really guide elk population and habitat management for the next decade or so. There's also been a number of timber harvest sales that have gone through recently, which will increase some timber harvest within the elk range. And the elk actually really like those timber harvests. It provides a lot of early successional forage and habitat for them that they really thrive on. And for me personally, I worked out west, I've seen lots of elk, but for me, when I see an elk in Wisconsin, it really just gets my blood pumping. I mean, it's just so cool knowing that these animals were absent from the landscape for such a long time and knowing the work that went in to bring them back. It's really something special for me. So next time you're in that area of the state, if you see an elk, just think about all the hard work and effort that went in on the human side to bring elk back, and the resilience and really just the wherewithal of these animals to reestablish themselves on our landscape. And with that, I'd like to thank my collaborators. I'd like to thank you guys for having me. And I think we can open it up for questions for myself or Ron.
Thank you very much, Anna. Very nicely done. Lots of great pictures. Just a comment from me. I always drive through Clam Lake and I'm always looking for elk. And when I was working at DNR, I had a lot of road miles. I've never seen one in Wisconsin. So I'm looking forward to someday seeing one in the not too distant future.
Yeah,
so
you gotta
start
fix
off
that.
with the first question here. And I'm gonna be asking these. So for people who don't know me, I'm Tom Giroux. I'm a member of the Forest History Association of Wisconsin. Where was the elk enclosure at Trout Lake located?
I don't know that. Ron, do you have any idea?
Well, yeah, my understanding was located east of Trout Lake, so likely in that Nebish Road area. There's a town road there called Nebish Road, goes out to Nebish Lake and Pallet Lake. So it was right in that area right there between Trout Lake and Pallet Lake.
Okay, why Jackson County of all counties for the second reintroduction?
I can answer that one too. The study that was done to determine what range in Wisconsin was suitable to elk, they picked out the large national forest. So in Northwest Wisconsin, the large Schwamigan-Nicolay National Forest there with the associated county forest nearby. And then over in Forest County, the Nicolay side of the Schwamigan-Nicolay National Forest was another big spot. There was a small area in central Vilas County that was suitable, and the big state forest there in Jackson County, an associated county forest. And it all turned into, okay, where can we get public support for introducing the elk? And like Anna said, parts of a beautiful spot would have been the Bayfield Peninsula, where they have a big barrens program with great suitable habitat for elk. But that was not the case because of public opposition to that area. In central Vilas County, just too many problems. The area was too small, not enough suitable habitat. And so the decision was Clam Lake. And then for Jackson County, it was really the people of Jackson County, the citizens there said, it was on the list, let's do it. And so the big state forest and then the Jackson County Forest, those folks around the county forest also were very happy to get elk. And so, Rocky Mountain Elk Foundation was a big supporter of this and funding, and the Ho-Chunk Nation that live in that area are also supported. So that's why Jackson County was picked.
Okay, moving on. Are you aware of the recent elk sighting in Vilas County? Can you tell us any more?
I was not aware of that one. Nope.
I was not aware of that one
any
either.
Information.
Nope. Do elk disperse like moose or do they tend to stay a little closer into their original range?
It seems like it depends on the population of elk. Elk out west are typically migratory and roam over a large tract of land. The elk in Wisconsin have largely stayed put close to where they were released. And we do get bulls that will disperse a little farther through the range. And every once in a while, you'll get a cow that kind of goes on an adventure. But for the most part, they've really stayed close to where they were established.
Yeah, it's
Okay.
kind of opposite the moose, where we get quite a few moose sightings in northern Wisconsin, and that's from the Upper Peninsula population, and they're the young bulls really do like to wander, much more so than elk, and so there are a few moose running around.
Mm-hmm.
From John Grossman, the map shown at the outset shows the southwest 2/3 of the state. It's mainly oak savanna. Is that historically better habitat for elk, the oak savanna?
I can speak generally here. It is where we have more records of elk in the state, and it may be because it was better habitat. It may also be because that's where European settlements and naturalists focused a lot of their time and energy in the early 1800s or early 1900s when Wisconsin was being more developed. And I will say that elk are really adapted to a more open habitat than you typically see in the Schwamigan, Nicolay area. They are pretty adaptable in terms of the habitats they can use, but it wouldn't surprise me that if historically the elk populations were larger in those open oak savannas and plains areas than they were in the more forested areas of Wisconsin, just because that's what they're adapted to survive in.
Yeah, that's really true. And if you're a Lewis and Clark fan like we are, travel out across the Great Plains and follow the way Lewis and Clark went in different spots, you'll know that when they were traveling, they hunted, and on the Great Plains, elk were abundant, along with buffalo and pronghorns and other things. When they got to the mountains where the current elk range is, they almost starved to death. So it really, I think it was that Merriam subspecies that was mostly in the plains, but Rocky Mountain elk there too. And it just changed today. The elk remaining are in the mountains, and hardly anything except for a few pockets here and there in some hilly area in the Great Plains.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, what is the estimated target population for the Clam Lake and Jackson County herds?
Clam Lake, I believe the 2012 elk management plan lists their population goal at 1,400. I'd have to double check that.
That's true, 1,400, yep.
Okay. Jackson County, I can't remember. I think
it's about 400.
100.
Okay. No, it's 400. 380
okay.
is what the 12 plan
that's right.
said. Yeah.
Yeah.
So total statewide about 1,800, and that's in 12. And so now there's a new plan being developed. So.
Right. Yep. So we'll have to see what the revised plan is now that they've completed the reintroductions from Kentucky and the elk have been on the landscape a little longer.
One interesting note is that, the original elk, the 25 elk from Michigan, that Michigan population in the northern part of the lower peninsula, the Pigeon River Country State Forest, that population was founded by just a few animals, like 18 animals or something. So, and then it did well and it grew, but again, the genetic diversity is low. And so we got 25 elk from a very low diverse genetic pool of elk. And that's why today the biologists are moving elk from here and there and trying to get the genetics right, because we want to make sure that we don't get any of that small population genetic problem.
Yeah, and that was part of the reasoning that the Wisconsin DNR partnered with Kentucky when they decided to bring more elk in, is because their the population that Kentucky started with was much larger and from several sources in the Western US. So their population genetics was much richer than Michigan's or Wisconsin's was. And they also didn't have any chronic wasting disease at that point in their elk population. So it was kind of an ideal population to pull more elk from because of that genetic diversity and because of disease safety.
Is there any egg crop damage issues in the state?
There are. Elk do like fields of corn. It's good eating for them. So there are some ag crop damage. There's also some conflicts with cranberry growers in the Jackson County area. And those issues are addressed by the agricultural damage program through USDA and the Wisconsin DNR.
So a little clarification from the person who thought there was a elk in Vilas County. She said maybe it was a moose, and I did see there was a moose in downtown Boulder Junction. So, Ron?
Yep, there was a moose. They have a trail cam or somebody took a picture out of their window at one of the motels right in downtown Boulder Junction of this young bull moose, and that animal's been seen around the area, Manitou Waters and Lac de Flambeau and so forth. So
Very cool.
I think it was a moose.
Does wolf predation occur on these animals in Wisconsin?
It does. Yep. Wolf predation definitely occurs. It doesn't seem like it's a big suppressor of the population growth, but we do have another grad student that I work closely with is investigating that relationship between wolves and elk in the state. So she's on a PhD track, so it'll be a few years yet before we get her results, but wolf predation does occur. We don't think it's a significant depressant of the population growth, but we are doing more research into it as we speak.
So I suppose this next one might be topic for the elk management plan. Population goals in Wisconsin. I mean, you already gave some information about that, but then are there other sites being planned for herds? And then what if they get outside of where there should be into more agricultural zones?
Yeah, as far as I know, there's no plans to establish any other herds. I won't say it's an impossibility, but I don't know of any immediate plans. There are, with chronic wasting disease spreading its geographic footprint in the Wisconsin deer population, there's concern about bringing elk to new areas where they may just end up getting infected with CWD. I think we already went over the population goals, but I don't know of any additional plans to move them to other parts unless there was a large local community support for bringing elk to a certain area. But again, all of that will depend on the CWD presence in that area.
I think, for as far as agricultural damage, there is a program to reimburse and to build fences. I know one cranberry grower in the Jackson County area is deciding on a large fence that'll solve the problem. And if elk grow in large number and go outside of where they're supposed to be, or where the state's planning, we do have the hunting season to solve those problems. An example is in northwestern Minnesota, up near far northwestern Minnesota, near the Canadian border. They have two small elk populations, much smaller than Wisconsin's. And the agriculture producers there are just adamant. They just hate the elk. And so the state has an aggressive hunting season to keep them really small and really limited to just some very small areas because of the agricultural producers. In Wisconsin, hopefully we're a little more farsighted than that, but hunting is a way to keep them where they're supposed to be.
And I think that issue will be addressed more fully in the upcoming elk management plan, now that we have enough elk where that's even a possible problem to have down the road. So we'll look forward to having more guidance on that with the new elk management plan.
And I would just remind people that there's opportunities for the public to comment on those management plans at the DNR website. And so, when it comes up, You can even register to be reminded about that kind of information. There's a way to do that on the website. And the public input is an important part of that process. So a question, oh, well, I'm gonna, just one announcement, just a reminder that they're in the chat is the doodle poll or the poll for the evaluation. So you might want to copy that into your clipboard so you can go to it after the program and fill out the evaluation, give our presenters and us some feedback on it, as John had mentioned earlier. So a couple more questions here. What is the primary food source here in Wisconsin for elk?
That is a really good question, and one that I'm trying to answer with my master's research. So elk are a little bit more, they're not as selective in their diet as deer. They do browse on trees and shrubs, but they also graze on grasses and sedges and forbs. So they like that mix of open habitat with those grasses and sedges. And then they also like some forest with good browse and hiding cover. So they are what you could probably classify as diet generalists. They'll mostly eat whatever's there. They do have some preferences for things like young aspen, certain grasses and forbs that are highly nutritious. And we're trying to dig into that a little bit more to see which plants that are available to them are most highly nutritious for them in northern Wisconsin.
So deer browsing, you can tell this question comes from a forester. Deer browsing is a big issue for forest regeneration. And how do elk contribute or maybe not contribute to the overbrowsing and regeneration issues in our forests?
They do certainly browse on trees. I know that the forester up in, the DNR forester up in Hayward gives me a hard time every time I talk to him. He's like, those elk are out eating my oaks again. So I know that they do browse on those young trees. Like I said, they also graze, so they are a little bit more diverse in their food source than deer. I would say, just my personal opinion and experience, I think there's so many more deer than there are elk. Their contribution to forest damage is probably pretty pale compared to the damage done by deer. But I'm also a little biased, so.
No, I'd second that completely. You know, deer are the problem, and locally maybe here and there elk a little bit overbrowsing, but elk, the numbers of elk that are planned and in the future are just pale in comparison to our deer population.
All right. That's the end of our questions that I can see. I got to just check one other spot. Every once in a while, somebody puts one in the Q&A, so. Go ahead, John.
Once again, this is a presentation that I think is going to get a lot of viewing because it's recorded and will be posted on YouTube. You'll be able to locate it by recontacting us via the website. So please be aware. You may know someone who wanted to be here who couldn't make it, and we'd encourage you to let them know that is recorded and can be seen again. Also be aware that as an organization, we have a keen interest in outreach to K-12 school systems. So if you know of a teacher potentially who'd like to get this type of information, make them aware of the fact that they can get that at that same site. Finally, I'd offer that feedback is pretty vital to our efforts to refine and modernize the way we serve a public. So please do take time to fill out the survey, and or if tomorrow or some future day, if you didn't offer feedback or want to offer more, please visit the website, our website, Forest History Association of Wisconsin. And there's a spot there that you can offer an email to us to pose a question or direct a question to potentially to one of our presenters. So I appreciate everyone who took time to join us. We truly appreciate the offering by Anna and Ron. Tomorrow's offering, there'll be another webinar tomorrow at 7 on fire towers. Perhaps you'd be interested in that as well. So thank you all for offering the program and for your participation. And perhaps we'll see you next time. Thank you. And with that, I think we can check out.
Yeah, we can. So,
Happy trails, everyone.
thanks, everyone. Bye.
Bye.